Australia's Foreign Minister has begun a diplomatic counter-offensive in the Pacific. She's rushed there in response to a tour by the Foreign Minister of China. So both of them are island hopping and wooing our neighbours. But where is New Zealand in all of this? Kethaki Masalamani reports.
Arm in arm, China's newest stronghold in the Pacific. The Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands welcomed China's Foreign Minister, singing the Republic's praises.
We admire the work that is done in pulling people out of poverty.
The Solomons is the first stop of Foreign Minister Wang Yi's tour of the Pacific, announced just days ago. The 10-day tour will see him visit 8 countries. His midnight arrival seen as an escalation in China's Pacific plans.
We don't know to what extent the Pacific Island governments will become dependent on China.
China has already signed a security pact with the Solomon Islands, which stipulates China will be able to send armed police and warships to assist the government. And there are concerns they could use the deal to one day secure a military base there.
This is the model, then, that the Chinese will be bringing to the other Pacific Islands.
It's raised alarm bells in Australia. Australia's new Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, racing to Fiji in an effort to keep them on side. The US, too, is keeping a close eye.
The ruling Chinese Communist Party has become more repressive at home and more aggressive abroad.
Foreign Minister Nanaia Mahuta wasn't available to comment, but this week has said China's interest in the Pacific doesn't come as a surprise. But National's Christopher Luxon says it raises questions on how good our intelligence is.
I think it was a bit of a shock, obviously, that we didn't know it was coming, and we sort of got asked some questions about that, and questions, as I said, about the depth of the relationships we actually have with the Pacific Island countries.
And questions are being raised on exactly what New Zealand's plan is to keep the peace in the Pacific. Kethaki Masalamani, News Hub.
Well, joining me now is National's Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Jerry Brownlee. OK, Jerry, there is a significant play for influence going on in the Pacific at the moment. What do we know about what China's ambitions are?
Well, I think you can, on the one hand, say perhaps it's a generous degree of activity by China to assist with Pacific development, to cooperate with Pacific nations in making life better for inhabitants of the Pacific. But you'd have to say this is a very big arrangement, and it does have 2 aspects to it that I think are cause of concern. One is the non-interference rule, the adherence to the multilateral approach from the UN, which of course China has a veto over. So there's a little bit of that surrendering of sovereignty that's an aspect here that should be a concern. Further, the word security is mentioned in the document without any specifics, except for reference to police and to law and order and the training of police and law and order sort of, I suppose you'd say, enforcement arrangements. I think those sort of are slight alarm bells for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that there is a bit of a tension here too, isn't there, Jerry? Because we don't seem so keen on China's influence in the Pacific in those respects. But they are also our greatest trading partner, and that's something that they seem to be offering as well to those Pacific nations potentially.
Oh, they are. They've offered a free trade agreement to Pacific nations that will obviously develop over time. Don't forget that New Zealand and Australia put together the Pacific Agreement, which was about facilitating trade around the Pacific. And the question is, how well have we done with that? I think that's another aspect of this. It's a kind of a wake-up all round here. This is our part of the world. That's where we have greatest connection and a lot of familial ties throughout New Zealand, as well as the sort of fact that we are increasingly presenting as a Pacific nation, which we've always been. So to have someone coming in and saying, hey, look, forget about those guys down to the south of you. Look up here, look to the east, and an entirely different culture. I think that's something we need to be at least a little bit more understanding of what the attraction is.
We have to take it seriously. We've seen pretty active outreach by the US and Australia now. Its new Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, is in Fiji, but you've been asking questions this week about our response, which does appear to be quite muted.
Yeah, it's not able to be. I can't understand why we've been so quiet on it and have had so little to say. I mean, the Prime Minister seemed to say something very confusing about, well, we stand by the Pacific and we're there to protect security, etc. well, what does that mean? In what context does that offer? I think our Foreign Minister should revisit all of those 21 countries or so, certainly the 10 that are involved in this arrangement, and discuss with them exactly what it is that is so attractive in this particular regard. Remember that, New Zealand has two of those countries, the Cook Islands and Niue, as realm countries who are also in those discussions.
One final question for you, Jerry. Do you think that our sort of muted response so far is because we're afraid of upsetting China?
Look, we have a very strong relationship with China. We've for decades been able to openly discuss our differences. We have a strong trading relationship with China. I don't see that going away, and there's no need for it to go away. We don't need to create an enemy. We don't have one. We do need to understand what changes are occurring in our backyard, in our region of the world, and work out too why it is that we haven't been able to perhaps meet the demands or show the respect to some of those countries that clearly has attracted them to China.
Well, Jerry Brownlee, thank you so much for joining us here on 8 o'clock.